there. That'll minimize. Okay, great. So, as I mentioned, I'm Kevin Rose. I'm the director of the Jefferson Project, and I took over in 2022. But the Jefferson Project has been going on now for 2023, completed our 10th year working at Lake George. And so we just completed a 10-year anniversary and produced a 10-year report, which is publicly available on our partner website, on the Lake George Association's website, and we can provide the link to you if anyone's interested in that. But that just gives you a sense on sort of how the Jefferson Project has evolved over time. What does it really mean? We'll get into that. What does it mean for Chautauqua during this presentation? But in that report, it shows you what have we done at Lake George and what are we bringing to bear at Chautauqua Lake. So in this slide, you can see some of the different approaches that we use. Over the past decade, for example, in the upper left, you can see what we call a vertical profiler. You see the solar panels on this pontoon-like setup. In 2023, we deployed the newest state-of-the-art vertical profilers designed by our in-house team in Chautauqua Lake. So we're on now our third generation of these. And below that, you see a heat map. The orange and purple colors indicate temperatures through the water column. We generate very large volumes of data with this approach, and then we can mine that and apply it with, use it with models to really understand the entire lake. And the diagram in the bottom left shows you a typical food web model. We model the food web of our study lakes. We also look at lake circulation and the water mass movement. We model weather, etc. We also continue to do stream surveys, experiments, and a lot of outreach too. So those are all the components that we do, and that's what we brought to bear at Chautauqua Lake. We are not a monolithic entity. We're not an environmental consulting firm. We're really a consortium. We really believe in the power of collaboration here. So we work closely with folks at SUNY Fredonia and Bowling Green State University, as well as partnerships across, for example, the Alliance, Chautauqua Lake and Water Management Alliance, or Watershed Management Alliance, Chautauqua Lake Partnership, Chautauqua Lake Association. Each of these organizations has been invaluable to us, whether providing historical contextual data, access to some sensors that occasionally we don't have access to. And of course, our partnerships with the Chautauqua Institution, Chautauqua County, the Ralph Sheldon Foundation, have been instrumental to our success in getting our operation to Lake George for the past several years now. Our project goals here going into 2023 was really to develop a holistic understanding of the water quality dynamics in Chautauqua Lake, accounting for spatial variability. So there's North Basin versus South Basin, but even within those basins, there's a lot of variability around the lake, and temporal variability, thinking about seasonality in the lakes and understanding why algal blooms, for example, happen when they do in the year, with an overall emphasis of trying to understand the causes of harmful algal blooms, ultimately to mitigate them, and before we can mitigate them, forecast when exactly they might be occurring to let people and other organizations on the lake be forewarned about their impending emergence. So in 2023, we applied a lot of technologies, a lot of different approaches to doing this. So we have the vertical profilers you can see in the upper left here. The vertical profilers on the lake, these are, as I mentioned, our latest generation vertical profilers. We have these sensors called, and you can see this picture in the middle, 3 people working on a sensor. It's called an acoustic Doppler current profiler, and measures water mass movement in 3 dimensions in the lake. And so we can use that to look at exchange between the basins, etc. We continued a manual sampling program because sensors can't do it all. We have a team of researchers that go out every 2 weeks at over a dozen sites around the lake and measure water quality. So this is things like nutrients, phytoplankton communities, zooplankton, etc. Technologically, we're taking that data off of our vertical profilers, and we've been using models to do it. This is led by a team at IBM Research looking at, for example, water mass movement. And we can see in this simulation, simulated particles from the South Basin and how quickly do they flow northward. And all of these simulations are validated with our measurements. That's something that might not mean much to many of you, but if you ask a lot of other organizations, how are your models validated? A lot of times they're not. Right? And so you just have to trust that the model works. But we don't trust that the models always work. We want to make sure that they do. We're also using satellite imagery to look at remote sensing up and down the basin across the North and South Basin. We use publicly available satellite imagery, and we have access to commercially available satellite imagery when needed. And we found some really interesting insights from mining historic satellite imagery that I'll show you. We also did some genomic sampling, where we're sampling for looking at the genes of different species, of especially the cyanobacteria. The overall goal there is to try to understand why blooms occur, these harmful algal blooms that occur, and why do they occur when they occur? What are the triggers for the blooms, and what are the triggers for toxin production? That's something we did the sampling this year, but we haven't done the genomic analyses yet, so all of those samples are still frozen. So that was beyond the scope of the funding that we had for 2023. In the upper right, we deployed nutrient sensors. So these were on loan as part of our partnership with other organizations, where we deployed these phosphate sensors that measure different forms of phosphorus in the bottoms of along the lake bottom. So we can look at, does the lake bottom release phosphorus, for example, during periods when the water column is stratified. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And finally, algal tiles. We conducted this survey this summer where we put out these tiles, pretty simple approach, but we look at algal growth on these tiles all around nearshore areas and then over the course of the season. And that gives us a sense on how quickly does the algae grow in different areas, and is there a difference between what we see in the water column and what's growing on the rocks in the benthos or the bottom area in nearshore areas around the lake. And we're still analyzing a lot of that data that came in. So what I'm going to highlight over the next 10, 15 minutes or so are some of our select findings. Here we have a tremendous amount of data. We've got over a 60-page report that you'll all get a copy of, and you're all invited to read that, comment on it, send us comments, any questions that you have. I hope that folks will share my email with you. I'll be very accessible to answer any questions you have. Here, we don't have time to get into 60 plus pages of reports, so we're just going to hit some of the highlights and why they're important and what they mean. So first, here is some historical data from 2022, as well as some contemporary data from 2023 on the left and the right, respectively, showing dissolved oxygen levels in phosphorus. So dissolved oxygen is oxygen, just like we need it to breathe. All complex life in aquatic ecosystems needs it as well. And dissolved oxygen, typically what we see is surface waters here. If you look at this heat map, the green on the left-hand side, this heat map, the green shows you where oxygen is plentiful. And close to the surface, we can see that it is plentiful. This is sufficient for all complex life forms. But below, as we go deeper into the water column of the North Basin, below about 10 meters or a little over 30 feet deep, that lake is consistently what's referred to as anoxic. So there is no oxygen during the most of the summer period and ending in the early fall in those deeper layers. So no complex life can live in those layers. It's effectively a dead zone in the bottom of the lake. Chemically, something really interesting happens when we lose oxygen. The sediments tend to release phosphorus that's typically bound to iron. That iron releases the phosphorus when it goes anoxic, when we lose oxygen. And that process is referred to as external loading. And we see that external loading consistently occurs in the North Basin, that when we lose that oxygen and we lose it for months at a time, then we get that internal loading of phosphorus. And we balance that with understanding external loading. And external loading is phosphorus or nitrogen that comes in from the watershed around the lake. And internal loading acts as a feedback mechanism that once you get a certain amount of external loading that's occurred, you typically get a lot of algal growth, a lot of algal blooms. Those algae settle out of the water column and die, and that decomposition, that's bacterial growth in the deep areas of the lake, consumes all the oxygen, and that process then releases that phosphorus from the sediments back to the water column and keeps it going anoxic. So what we see there is a positive feedback loop operating, driven by external loading ultimately, but then locked into place because of that internal feedback mechanism. Later in the fall, as you see here, the green dominates the full area of the water column here, and the blue declines and drops out of the picture by mid to late September. What we see there is the lake is cooling down, and then oxygen from the atmosphere is then mixed all the way top to bottom as the lake cools down. And the top graph we can see is SRP, which is soluble reactive phosphorus, we can think about that as junk food for the algae. And that becomes really available in August to September. On the right-hand side, what we see is something interesting. This is data from the south basin of the lake. And here you see another heat map, which is the blue to white, and that shows you oxygen saturation, or a measure of oxygen availability. Now, typically, the south basin, we tended to think about it as there's probably none of this internal loading occurring. It probably doesn't go anoxic. But we can see, and this is a scale over several days here, not months like we see on the left-hand side, just over the course of several days, and we see this repeatedly throughout 2023, is that the bottom of the south basin goes anoxic for short periods of time. And when it goes anoxic, and we can see this is our really high-frequency phosphorus data now in this red line, we can see that when it goes anoxic, we typically get a pulse of phosphorus coming up, meaning that it'll lose oxygen for short periods of time, maybe a day, and then as soon as you lose oxygen, phosphorus immediately spikes coming out of the sediments of the south basin. This is really important because it means that we not only have internal loading occurring in the north basin, we also see it in the south basin, and that's something that wasn't believed to occur previously. Now, why is it occurring in the south basin? What we see here, this is probably based on what I could see in the room. These figures are pretty small for folks, especially in the back of the room, so I'll explain what we're seeing here. I'll start with the top here, is we're looking at data from our acoustic Doppler current profilers. These show us water mass movement in the lake. And over the course of several days, what we see is that when we get these transient stratification events in the south basin, that we get very calm conditions, right? So wind speed is low, and that means then that the surface temperatures actually warm up more than the deeper water temperatures. And you can see that in the bottom figure. This is that bottom figure. You can see the orange to yellow is high temperatures, and the black or purples are lower temperatures. And during these transient stratification events, that temperature is different through the water column. That's what we would call stratification. And that's when then, as soon as it stratifies, there's so much organic matter in the water column there, it goes anoxic within a single day of it. So all the oxygen is consumed in those deeper layers, and as soon as that happens, then we get that internal loading of phosphorus coming out of the sediments. And we also see in the green figure, that's phycocyanin. Phycocyanin is a pigment that cyanobacteria produce, and so we can use this sensor as an indicator for cyanobacteria. Well, when it gets really calm like that, and we get temporary stratification, we also see those really dark green areas. Those are right near the surface because all the algae are floating up, and that's often when we see some severe blooms that are occurring. So another thing that we've discovered using our data is that we also see these short-term internal loading events in the North Basin. So I mentioned how we get this internal loading that occurs that when the lake goes anoxic, that sediments can release phosphorus, and that definitely occurs, and that's locked the lake into this feedback loop where typically, we're getting external loading coming in, seeding the water column, seeding the sediments with phosphorus, and then the sediments are acting like a continual source of phosphorus in addition to what's coming in from watershed. We see occasional these pulse increase of conductance, and you see this in the bottom figure here. This dark green to yellow this is a measure of conductivity. So we can think about it as salts, but it's not just like salt, like table salt. This is any types of ions in the water. So it includes things like iron, and so with this peak, we see this event, for example, on July 30th, where a lot of this came up higher into the water column, and the blue on top of that is a different water layer. That's your surface waters with lower conductivity. And we see this pulse coming up into the upper part of the water column. This is really important because it shows that those nutrients that come out of the sediments don't just stay in the bottom of the water column, that there's these events that occur, these transient events, even in the North Basin, that pulse or drive the upward flow of nutrients from the sediments into even the upper part of the water column. And this, we think, seeds the algal blooms that later occur. So this discovery, consistent also with the transient stratification that we see in the South Basin, gives us a tool to begin forecasting algal blooms, because we think that the algal blooms, while we know they need light, they need nutrients, and they need calm weather conditions, And the fact that we can now see what we think is this increase in phosphorus coming out of the sediments and then peaking, being pulsed upward through the water column gives us the ability to start developing forecasts of when exactly harmful algal blooms will occur. Another really useful tool to understand both current dynamics as well as historical dynamics is satellite remote sensing imagery. Chautauqua Lake is a very nice, large lake, and so we can use that ability, use that size and the ability of satellites that typically don't see really small things to go back in time to look at these past couple years as well as go back even over several decades. And so there's the EPA and NOAA, there's something called the ScienceBased Project that has put out a lot of imagery, publicly available imagery, and we've mined that and processed that specific for Lake Chautauqua. And we've coupled that also with our in the water and sort of around the lake measurements that we make. And so now we can really understand both from the satellite, what does the satellite see, as well as how does that reflect what's going on under the water. So that's something that really nobody else in the world is doing, this sort of technological merging of different data sets like this. In the upper left, this is something called the cyanobacteria index, or CI. When that's high, it means it's a really severe, the satellite is seeing really severe blooms across the surface of the lake. And this goes back, we're just showing here about the last 8 years of data. And the two graphs, the upper one is showing the North Basin and the lower one is showing the South Basin. And first thing that sticks out, you can see the South Basin typically gets, what the satellite can see is much more severe algal blooms in the South Basin and North Basin. Probably doesn't surprise that many people, but there's some other very interesting things in there. We can see the algal blooms are not a new phenomenon by any means. And if we look back through the early 2000s, they were consistently occurring then as well. We can also see that there's a delay between when the North Basin and South Basins occur as well. Typically, the algal blooms in the north we believe, are more strongly limited because of that stratification, that seasonal stratification limits a lot of that nutrient pulsing up to the upper part of water column. Meanwhile, the South Basin shows a more predictable seasonal pattern. Now we've taken these seasonal patterns and decomposed them and looked for correlates between air temperature, wind speed, Schmidt stability. That's a measure of how strongly stratified is that water column. Do we see big differences between the surface waters and deep waters, or small differences in temperature? Big differences means it's really strongly stratified, or Schmidt stability is really high. And then here is cyanobacteria index for South Basin and North Basin. This just shows two example years, 2021 and 2009, where we can now look at the full seasonal dynamics. So the remote sensing tool gives us the ability to look at spatial heterogeneity. It gives us the ability to merge historical data sets with our in situ data sets. And using this, we are beginning to discover that there's different seasonal patterns that occur. Definitely, every year is definitely not the same as the others. And it's driven a lot by the spring mixing dynamics that based on the timing of when that water column stratification sets up, how much ice was on the lake the preceding year determines what the water temperature is in the springtime. How warm does do deep water temperatures get? And the cyanobacteria tend to do best when those deep water temperatures are really nice and warm. Now moving out of our sensor and satellite imagery processing a little bit is just tell you a little bit more about our sampling program. As I mentioned, we can't do everything with sensors, and so we still have this consistent sampling program. And this is really the hallmark of a lot of monitoring programs, is that sampling is done and has been done historically in Chautauqua Lake, and we appreciate others having shared data with us to look at historical concentrations and whatnot. For the last 3 years now, we've been maintaining this sampling program. In 2023, you can see the data that we collected there in the blue lines. And what you're seeing on the left is total nitrogen, in the middle is ammonium, and in the bottom is nitrate. And you're looking at the different forms of total nitrogen. And we can see then the seasonal dynamics between the North Basin and the South Basin. On the right-hand side is phosphorus. So left-hand side is nitrogen, right-hand side is phosphorus between the North and South Basin. Again, the different color lines indicate the different years. And we can see some interesting dynamics here. For example, there's a lot of variation in the nutrient chemistry. The different forms of nitrogen and phosphorus are doing different things. There's a consistent trend of increasing soluble reactive phosphorus in the season, as we progress in the season across all years. Soluble reactive phosphorus, like I said, is really like the junk food for the algae. And so we can see, for example, here in the North Basin, as the season progresses, SRP tends to increase, and we get that peak there later in the year. The ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus can indicate cyanobacteria dominance. So if we go back here to our diagram showing nitrogen and phosphorus levels, and we calculate the ratio between nitrogen and phosphorus, that can tell us something really important about what is driving the changes in the phytoplankton community that we see. As a rule of thumb, those cyanobacteria, they're the ones that form those harmful algal blooms that can form toxins on the lake. Those cyanobacteria dominate when the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio drops below about 30. And we can see across both the South and the North Basin, that ratio is solidly below 30. Give you a sense for context, and one of the benefits of us working in other lakes is that the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio in Lake George has just started in recent years to drop below 30. It's dropping below 30 because phosphorus concentrations have been going up, and nitrogen concentrations in that lake have been actually going down, mostly because atmospheric deposition is going down. The air is getting cleaner throughout the Northeast. But nitrogen going down, phosphorus going up, means that that ratio between those two is changing. And we're seeing there cyanobacteria really starting to dominate. And in Chautauqua Lake, the ratio is solidly below 30, and we see consistent cyanobacteria dominance of the phytoplankton community. There's research, I mentioned, I'm currently doing research in New Zealand. Part of the work here is looking at the ability, how does that changing ratio also affect toxin productions? And what they've discovered here, I was just talking to a collaborator the other day about this, that when you increase phosphorus concentrations, you end up typically increasing the toxicity of the blooms themselves. So this all means for Chautauqua Lake, a key management challenge is really to drop the phosphorus loading and really first get a good sense of what the phosphorus budget looks like, and then do proactive management really geared toward reducing phosphorus concentrations in the lake. And we have this challenge because there's both internal and external loading, right? So we can't just focus on one or the other. And frankly, there is no short-term solution to this, unfortunately. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the conclusions. So another project or aspect to the project is modeling of water mass movement in the lake. And this has been where it's been very tremendously valuable to have IBM and the computational power and the expertise, the modeling expertise that they have as a partner on the project. And what the team has done and looked at is this exchange of water mass between the basins. Typically, the historical belief was that the North Basin flows in the South Basin, that flows out and moves downstream. The reality is, though, that there is definite exchange. As I showed you on the method slide right at the very beginning, there's exchange between the two basins. Right? And if we look at this graph here, we can see this yellowish greenish color and a dark green color. Those are different layers in the water column. And we can see that when there's one flow in one direction, there's the opposite flow in the other direction. So the surface at about 1 to 2 feet is a lot different than 30 feet deep, and it's moving in opposite directions consistently all the time. So there's a substantial amount of interbasin exchange through the lake. Other things that we've learned about the lake is that there are internal waves that traverse the lake. So the surface might be completely calm, but we see these waves moving through that thermal structure in the lake. They can crash into sediments, and they can also resuspend nutrients in the lake. Things like the presence of macrophytes can reduce the loading of nutrients, can stabilize the sediments, just like planting a tree on a steep hillside stabilizes the sediments. Macrophytes can stabilize the sediments and reduce that internal wave action as well. And so that's something that we want to account for more in the future, is really understanding the presence of macrophytes and what role they play in harmful algal blooms. So So a little bit to summarize what I've just showed you, our focus has been on harmful algal blooms and overall water quality characterization. Here I've just highlighted some of the key results about dissolved oxygen, about phosphorus and nitrogen. Thinking forward about management, how do we take these results and do something about it? A real focus should be on understanding, quantifying external loading and internal loading. And with internal loading, improving dissolved oxygen has to be a key goal, because internal loading only occurs when oxygen is not present, right? So when oxygen is available, we do not get any internal loading. There is no short-term solution to this because, for example, if we were to apply a chemical treatment like alum to the lake, that will bind with the phosphorus and pull it out, but we still have a lot of ongoing external loading to occur. We don't know yet what individual catchment scale loading looks like. We're in the process of deploying tributary monitoring stations with support from the Chautauqua Institution and partners, deploying these to look at sub-watershed specific details. Talk about that more over the next couple slides. I've just got a couple more. Here, we didn't assess the impacts of macrophyte management. Future research is likely warranted to look at the interplay between macrophytes and algal blooms, and really developing and refining a nutrient budget. I'll talk about that on the next in 2 slides. But consistently in the future, another key goal should be continuing the monitoring that we've started and we've now done for 3 years. Here, this gives us the ability to identify trends, provide early warning indicators of potential harmful algal blooms on a season-by-season basis, and we can only really know if management remediation actions are effective if we continue to measure water quality. We can't manage it if we don't measure it. Another thing we are fully invested in addition to this presentation to all of you, is we are strong advocates for science-based management, and hence why we really appreciate the support you've given us here. We've got a number of presentations that we gave over the course of the summer. We have, as of this past year, the first researcher in residence at the Chautauqua Institution, Dr. Allison Reisick. Her picture is shown down below. She is a research member. She's a research staff with Rensselaer, my university. She reports to me. She's also an expert in phytoplankton ecology. Right? So we have someone sort of boots on the ground presence there, really invested in the lake. And we're also committed to continuing the results of this. Science really can't do much without management, and management needs the will of the people. And so we need to translate the results that we have to broader audiences. Wrapping up now, in terms of next steps, I mentioned understanding and refining our phosphorus budgets and really understanding this external loading and how much that contributes to that internal loading that can occur. And so we've just started to dig into this, but it really needs refinement, and along with the tributary monitoring stations that will soon to be deployed. And we want to understand, where is that phosphorus coming from? Where is the nitrogen coming from exactly? What types of events does it come in with? Is it only with the biggest precipitation events? That's what we've seen in other lakes that we studied. For example, in Skinny Atlas Lake, one of the Finger Lakes, we've seen that a vast majority of the phosphorus gets deposited with really extreme precipitation events, like they had a major severe storm in spring 2017 that then laid the groundwork for harmful algal blooms that they've had every season since. So understanding what types of events and where around the lake the phosphorus is coming from gives us the ability to dial in really proactive management and assess how important are things like riparian buffer zones, swales, other artificially constructed structures that might prevent the flow of phosphorus and nitrogen into the lake. And so individual catchment scale loading requires further investigation. This is really something that hasn't been done on the lake in a detailed fashion. And it's something that we can really leverage our remote sensing, our models, and our sensors to do as a key next step to the project. And with that, I'll say, I'll ask Harry if you have any further input that you want to cover. And if not, I'll see if anybody has any questions that we can answer.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that's fine. The only thing I would mention is a couple of slides ago, there was a couple of pictures of the new stream stations, tributary monitoring stations, just for everybody to see. They're now being deployed. These are all custom built, custom engineered, very special, environmentally friendly mounts. Instead of pouring concrete slabs and excavation and things like that, they go on in with helical screws. So they're low impact to the environment, and they can also be easily moved. So these basically house all the instrumentation, electronics, etc. They're powered, and next to them obviously is a stream with basically piping going down for different types of sensors to be placed in during seasonal times off winter, and also for us to actually extract samples, samples that are connected to the sophisticated sort of computer monitoring that we have, that if there are events on the lake, etc., they can trigger actual physical sampling that can then be taken to the lab, as well as just sensors, etc. So I just wanted to mention that because that's transpiring right now, and there will be an additional station, not looking like this, but on the river on the outlet to give us information what's going on sort of downstream from Celeron, etc. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Harry. So we're happy to take questions if anybody has questions. And I'm happy to send out my email to anybody if anybody wants to follow up one-on-one individually afterward. And hopefully you'll all get a copy of our report soon.
Our emails are both on the last page of the report.
At this time, we'd also like to introduce Michael Hill, the president of Chautauqua Institution. Michael is on. So Michael, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thanks, BJ, and I just want to thank Kevin and Harry and all of our colleagues at the Jefferson Project who really have, we're now multi-year partners, and their deep commitment to our lake and understanding how we make advances is really uplifting for us. So thank you for that. I also want to, in a really special way, thank all of our friends and colleagues in the Chautauqua County Legislature and PJ for the investment of the past year, and also our colleagues at the Sheldon Foundation who have made this possible. So excited to see this report, excited to have you see this report, and I know both Harry and Kevin are ready to answer your questions. So just profound thanks from me to all of you, and looking forward to our ongoing partnership.
Any questions? Try to direct them. Yes. You want to step up to the microphone? Actually, I can convey if you would. You can go ahead and step to the microphone if they may be able to hear you through that system. I'm not sure.
So you've been working on Chautauqua Lake for 3 years, and you've been at Lake George for 10. What would you say has been the outcome of your work at Lake George? What has been the accomplishments that you have seen?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So when we first started at Lake George, one of the key challenges was road salt and road salt mitigation. And their salt concentrations had tripled since our monitoring program began in 1980. And since then, since we began monitoring, we've identified the key sources of where the road salt's coming from, the sub-basins around the lake. We've developed the ability to look at how important are storm events coming in and driving road salt. And we've also done modeling to project out how is that road salt going to change with different management programs around the lake. We've partnered with the Lake George Association there to develop a salt summit that the Lake George Association leads every year, where they bring in local municipalities, as well as many now people come in from municipalities from up to over a dozen different states to develop methods to reduce salt application. And so we've now seen the road salt concentrations have plateaued in the lake in the last 5 years. We've actually seen in one stream where road salt was a major contaminant, road salt has declined, the salt concentration has declined nearly 40% over the last 6 years. And so that's the type of management, that's the type of goal that we have for Chautauqua. Now, what I'm talking about for Chautauqua is a bit different because we're dealing with nitrogen and phosphorus loading. We do have road salt in Chautauqua, as we do in any area where we get road salt application to our roads. And that is a concern, but the number one concern for harmful algal blooms for water quality is the excess phosphorus and nitrogen loading. We haven't had that problem in Lake George, or nearly as much as Lake George there. It's been road salts, but we have had tremendous success there in reducing that. The report overall highlights 6 major successes that we've had. And road salt is front and center as one of the ones, but we have other ones too. For example, we've developed the world's only harmful algal bloom forecasting system that we have at Lake George, where now we send an email to the Lake George Association, our partners there, within a couple days of when our sensors and our models are telling us that a harmful algal bloom might be coming. So that's a type of technology that we've pioneered there that we also want to bring to bear once we have this better understanding of the Chautauqua system to be able to forecast blooms at Chautauqua Lake as well.
One of the key is, as Kevin has said, so the collaboration part, we've listened. Now, again, we do not have the same issues, but where we're uniquely different is our lake is primarily surrounded by the state roads, and it's also a lake traversed by an interstate. So if you happen to drive along Chautauqua Lake and you look at that beautiful bridge, you'll see these nice white columns going down. Those are drop inlets. And as I talk to the DOT, what happens when they freeze? We dump a bucket of salt there. Where does the salt go? It goes in the lake. So we don't have the issues that Kevin talked about in Lake George, but in this collaboration, I've reached out to the DOT. I've also reached out to DEC and now said, can we capture that salt from instead of going into the lake, pouring into the lake? Can we capture that, add a system to the bridge? The DEC calls it low-hanging fruit. They feel it's something that can be done. I think it's an inexpensive fix, but not so much a huge impact, but at least it's the collaborative study that, okay, if we know road salt's an issue in Lake George, it's not an issue here, but it would also help us by trying to take a little bit of initiative and being proactive. So what this collaboration has done for us is opened our eyes to a couple little things that we can pick up on. But the science that these gentlemen in this is bringing, we have a resident scientist living here in this county because of this project. This, as you see, without a better, there's no joke out there. This is science in that lake. Nothing anecdotal, no old wives' tales, no old fisherman stories. This is the science working and telling us what is happening. So again, on behalf of myself and the legislature, Harry and Kevin, thank you so much for all you do. And with Michael, again, there are some opportunities we're still focused on in the future, but thank you so much for all of your work and the partnership we've done. Any other questions that anybody has?
Kevin, I got a question. Kevin, so you shared all this data and so on and so forth with us. What do we do now? What's our next step? How do we be proactive and start attacking the algal blooms? What do we need to do?
Yeah, great question. It's really about the phosphorus and nitrogen reductions. The algal blooms will stop and certainly decline when phosphorus and nitrogen concentrations decline. The challenge there is that the system is sort of locked into this feedback because anoxia occurs consistently every year. So reducing external loading is key. It's not going to be an easy thing to do because it comes from, we typically organize it by point source and non-point sources or loading. Point sources are relatively easy to manage because it's, a point source is when you get a lot of nutrient input from one specific location, like a wastewater treatment plant. A lot of it comes from non-point source, which is things like impervious surfaces, buildings, roads, septic systems, agricultural fields. That's a lot more challenging. Understanding, though, how much implementing riparian buffer zone protections is key. Building other approaches like that are really key. The challenge also is that typically what we've seen in Skinny Atlas Lake, what we've seen in Lake George, is that our precipitation is trending upward. And when we get more and more precipitation, as we're seeing, especially in really severe storms, that flushes a lot of that phosphorus off the watershed really quickly. So that's an impact of climate change that our long-term records are showing is occurring. But it just means that proactive localized management becomes more important. And having some place for all that stormwater runoff to go that doesn't go immediately into the lake, retention ponds, et cetera, they become more important. So slowing down the rate of input and flushing into the lake, as well as trying to reduce phosphorus loads coming into the lake, phosphorus concentrations that might be applied as fertilizer in many places, that's going to be key to this problem. Trying to improve dissolved oxygen concentrations to reduce that internal loading is also key.
One of the pieces, if we could, too, to tap into, the internal loading is what we have. We know there's an issue. Also important why we're going down, myself, Pierre, Dave McCoy, and Mark Ice are going down to lobby with our lobbyists, meeting with Senator Schumer, Congressman Langworthy, is this Army Corps of Engineers Aquatic Ecosystem Restoration and the Army Corps' New Start Project. We're able to take the science now from Jefferson and say, they're telling you if we get the garbage out of the lake, we start to improve it. Thus, another reason and a push for us to get that assistance from the Army Corps and getting a plan in place for that ecosystem restoration project. So this is all working. We're moving constantly to try to get this going. But this science, as Bob had asked, what do we do next? These are steps that we're going to continue to pursue. And again, it's no easy task. You know, Kevin made a good point. When was the best time to plant a tree 25 years ago? When's the second best time? Today. And that's what we feel the Jefferson Project is, and what we're doing now. Today is the day we start to make those changes. And we've been doing that. This partnership is going to continue. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you so much, Kevin, Harry, and Michael. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all again for your support. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.